What's good, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Thank you for joining me. This is episode 26 of Hockey on the Spot, and today we continue with the 30 teams in 30 days for the month of August, coming toward the end. And for today, we are going to take a look at the Columbus Blue Jackets. The Columbus Blue Jackets, the other team that moves over from the Western Conference to the Eastern Conference, and where the Detroit Red Wings moved up to the new Atlantic Division, the Columbus Blue Jackets moved to the Metropolitan Division, and of course the Winnipeg Jets going west to the Central Division. And last season, in the Central Division, when the Blue Jackets were still in the West, a very interesting season, an up and down kind of year, or should I say more like a down and up kind of year. A season that in which they began the year recovering from a trade of a fan favorite player, Rick Nash, being traded to the New York Rangers, a trade in which they would get Artem Anisimov, Brandon Dubinsky, prospect defenseman Tim Erickson, who could be ready to play in the NHL this year, and a first-round draft pick. Rangers also got prospect defenseman Steve DeLeasley in that trade. Of course, he would then be traded back to the Blue Jackets in the Marian Gaborik trade. The season did not start out strong. They would win their first game of the year against the Nashville Predators, but after that, everything just fell apart. Scott Housen was still the GM at the time, and with him as GM, the team would go 4-8-2 until Tuesday, February 12th, 2013. Ironically, the same exact day in which the New York Rangers had a game against the Boston Bruins at the TD Bank North Garden, a game in which the Rangers would win by a final score of 4-3 in a shootout. The first goal of the game would come off a highlight reel assist by Rick Nash, arguably the assist of the year, on a goal which would eventually be scored by Carl Hagelin. Coincidentally, around the time of that assist would be when then General Manager Scott Housen, the same guy who traded Rick Nash, would be fired out of Columbus. And then not too long after that, Jarmo Kekalainen would become the first ever European general manager in Columbus Blue Jackets history. And the team would still continue through their rough start. When he first came, they would lose 4 more times in regulation and 2 more times in overtime/shootout, capping off a 4-12-4 start to their season. But then all of a sudden, everything started to click, and Sergei Bobrovsky really turned it on. The team would go 25-3 in their last 28 games and would finish first place among teams that did not make the playoffs. It came down to the very last day. Because of Sergei Bobrovsky, they came this close to making the playoffs, finishing 9th in the Western Conference with 55 points. Those 55 points tied with the Minnesota Wild, but the Wild had a better ROW, and in the overall league, the New York Islanders are also thrown in that tie with 55 points. They made the playoffs last year. The Blue Jackets would finish last among those three, with the Islanders in the middle and the Wild up top. But for the Blue Jackets, it really did come down to the last day. They would win their last game of the year against the Nashville Predators, which means if at least one of the Minnesota Wild or the Detroit Red Wings had lost their respective games, and in regulation, the Blue Jackets would have been in. Unfortunately for them, the Wild would defeat the Colorado Avalanche that same night, and the Red Wings would defeat the Dallas Stars. So both those two would make the playoffs, and the Blue Jackets would miss. So it made for an off season that honestly wasn't that active as far as player signings. It really came more toward the draft, and of course a reflection of a trade that happened the day before the trade deadline, or the day of the trade deadline, excuse me. Another trade with the New York Rangers, and really the first blockbuster trade in the franchise's history. We mentioned they acquired back prospect defenseman Steve DeLeasley in that trade, as well as another prospect defenseman. But the main guy they acquired in that trade would be Marian Gaborik from the New York Rangers. They would acquire him in a blockbuster trade, the first real serious trade in the franchise's history, a team that's only made the playoffs once, and that was in 2009. But they suffered a very quick and early and painless first-round sweep to the hand of the Detroit Red Wings. And to get Gaborik, though, they had to give up quite a bit. They would trade Derek Brassard, Derek Dorsett, and young defenseman John Moore away in that trade to the New York Rangers. So they've had a lot of history with the New York Rangers in the recent years, and that also goes back to a few years ago, the Nikolai Zherdev trade, in which the Rangers acquired Nikolai Zherdev and Dan Fritchie in exchange for defenseman Christian Bachman and Fedor Tyutin. Fedor Tyutin is the only player remaining with the respective team traded to from that trade. He is still a Columbus Blue Jacket. 5 ex-New York Rangers now on the Columbus Blue Jackets this year. Brandon Dubinsky, Artem Anisimov, Fedor Tyutin, Tim Erikson, and Marian Gaborik. And Artem Anisimov this offseason, along with Sergei Bobrovsky, would both be signed to contract extensions. Bobrovsky for 2 years. And they also hired in John Davidson as their president of hockey operations. So it's making for a pretty interesting offseason for the Blue Jackets. And a lot of the team's previous history of failure had to do with the fact that only out of the 11 top 6 picks that they've had in their franchise history, only one of them is still with the team today. That is forward Ryan Johansson, and of course now defenseman Ryan Murray. He'll get a chance to make the team this year. This year, the team did not have a pick in the top 6. However, they had 3 picks in the first round, which they would use to select quite a few players, actually. Alexander Wenberg, Kirby Reichel, and Marco Dano, 3 players who have bright futures in the National Hockey League one day. And then again, that was really the most active part of their offseason. This offseason, they didn't lose much, and they didn't get much. The only actual subtractions for them this year, Nick Drasnovich, a youngster who went to the Pittsburgh Penguins, but he never really played a game for the Blue Jackets. And then Colton Gillies, a former first-round draft pick of the Minnesota Wild, been a big disappointment since his draft. The Blue Jackets are not bringing him back. He's still unsigned. And then Vinny Prospal and Adrian Aucoin, both veterans. They are still unrestricted free agents, but neither of them will be back. Vinny Prospal, another former New York Ranger. But with this team going younger, there is no room for them to bring Prospal back, even if they would like to. And even in the additions, they didn't do much either. They did get 2 guys who will both battle to be backup goaltender because Michael Leighton also left the team to go to the KHL. They brought in Curtis McElhaney from their AHL affiliate, the Springfield Falcons. They officially signed him. And they also brought in goaltender Mike McKenna, who hasn't played in the NHL for a while. Last played for the New Jersey Devils. McElhaney last played for the Phoenix Coyotes. They will both battle for the responsibility of being backup goaltender. They also bring in right winger Jack Skilly coming over from the Florida Panthers. He'll figure to add some depth if he does play, that is. A former high draft pick, former 7th overall pick in 2005, has not lived up to his draft status, and again, who knows if he will even play. But when he does, he'll definitely add some depth, and a guy who could possibly be a 13th or 14th forward. But despite the fact that they did not make too many moves this offseason, they did make one move of real significance and surprise. Nathan Horton, who played last season and has played the last few years for the Boston Bruins, went to the Stanley Cup Finals 2 out of the 3 times he has been with them and won the Stanley Cup once with them in 2011, has signed a long-term deal, 7 years, over $35 million with the Columbus Blue Jackets. And a big surprise, the first real serious signing that the Blue Jackets franchise has ever had. Real big surprise that a player like Nathan Horton, a guy with Stanley Cup experience, would even go to a team like the Columbus Blue Jackets, considering that they've never been a real high market and a market that no one's ever wanted to go to because of their failure to make the playoffs. But he signed long-term. Your prototypical power forward, former third overall pick in 2003 by the Florida Panthers. And again, your prototypical power forward, a guy who makes things happen, scores big goals in big situations, be a big addition to their top six, figures to be their second line right winger to add a 1-2 punch on the right wing between him on the second line and Marian Gaborik on the top line. So that should figure to be a very interesting situation. The only downside about this is that Nathan Horton did have off-season surgery, and he will be missing a good portion of the beginning of the season. He'll be missing a good portion of the beginning of the year. Is not expected to play until around late December, early January, which means he won't be back until pretty much close to the second half of the year, which is when they will really need him. But when healthy, this guy is a game changer and a power forward that really scores big goals in big situations. Again, it's similar to the David Clarkson signing where I like the player, but I don't like the contract. However, this long-term contract isn't as bad as David Clarkson's because he is a better player than David Clarkson. So it's still bad, but not as bad. Because, again, what if Nathan Horton, a guy who's had injury problems throughout his career, does continue to have injury problems? Then the Blue Jackets would be facing the longevity of this contract signing. And it really would hurt them as far as cap space goes. It really would. So that's why I kind of question it. But overall, I think it's a good signing for the Blue Jackets. And again, their first serious signing probably ever. Which does lead us to a couple of questions for the Columbus Blue Jackets. How will they do as an overall team this year? Who figures to play on the bottom six pairs? We already know what their top six is going to look like, figuring that Artem Anisimov, who is now fully healthy, could finally have a breakout year and be their top line center. Ryan Johansson, same thing, with probably take a second line center role. Cam Atkinson, he could have a breakout year this year. Marian Gaborik, he should have a comeback year this year. Nathan Horton, of course, and RJ Umberger. Brandon Dubinsky will most likely figure in as the third-line center, Nick Foligno as the third-line winger, and Matt Calvert should play on that line as well. And then Mark Letestu, a guy who could battle Dubinsky for that third-line spot. He figures to begin the year on the fourth line. He led the Blue Jackets in goals last year, and Blake Como, Jared Bull. And then again, Derek McKenzie and Jack Skilly would also be thrown in there. So who plays? And then the other big question, who plays while Nathan Horton's out? Biggest possibility, probably a guy like Bowen Jenner, one of their top prospects. He's a guy who definitely could be ready to make the team this year, and if not, definitely play a role as their top line center in Springfield this year. And then, of course, on defense, Jack Johnson, Fedor Tyutin, Nikita Nikitin, James Wisniewski, and then two guys who are both ready to play full-time, Ryan Murray and Tim Erickson. And then, of course, Dalton Prout would probably be their seventh guy. David Savard could also be thrown in there. They have a lot of options. And then in goal, Sergei Bobrovsky is definitely the starter. And then either Curtis McElhaney or Mike McKenna will be the backup. That's going to be one question, which one of them will back up. And how well will they do offensively this year? That was really the big problem for Columbus last year. Offense is really their weakness. Defense, they're all set. They are absolutely stacked on defense. Their top four is unbelievable, and the two youngsters coming up, or other potential youngsters they could have as well, they are stacked on defense, but it is up front where they have the problems. And the real big question is, can Marian Gaborik go back to being that 30-40 goal scorer he used to be? And can a guy like Brandon Dubinsky maybe pick up his game, and go back to the form he was in 2 seasons ago, or from 2010, 2011. And probably the biggest question of all, can Sergei Bobrovsky have as good of a year this year? And that's really going to be the big question because, again, Curtis McElhinney and Mike McKenna, those guys are not backup goaltenders that are going to see a lot of playing time. Sergei Bobrovsky is going to have probably be in the top of the league as far as minutes among goaltenders go. He's going to see a lot of time, and he's not going to get a break. So that could be a big problem, and that could make for a really inconsistent season. Not to mention, again, even though they do move to the Eastern Conference and have a little bit of easier travel time, as far as the teams that they'll be playing with, they're in the Metropolitan Division now. That's going to make things very hard going up against the three New York teams, the New Jersey Devils, and then the Islanders and the Rangers. And then, of course, the Pittsburgh Penguins, Washington Capitals, a rebuilding Philadelphia Flyers team, a Carolina Hurricanes team that's on a rebuild. So that could make for some problems for the Columbus Blue Jackets. Not to mention, all those guys are more down south. The Blue Jackets, realistically, although they're in the Mid-East, they're much closer as far as distance go to the guys in the Atlantic Division other than the Florida Panthers and the Tampa Bay Lightning. They're much closer to the other 6 teams. So traveling could be a big problem for this team as well, which could be a big question for this team. Now, let's take a look at this team's top prospects as we see if these questions can be answered as the season goes through. To me, this is a very, very deep top 10 prospect pool. Ryan Murray, no question, their top prospect. He's ready to play in the NHL. Bowen Jenner, number 2. He could be ready to play in the NHL. Oscar Dansk, number 3. And then all 3 of their first-round picks from last year, from this past draft, Alexander Wenberg, Kirby Reichel, and Marco Dano are on here. Mike Riley, who was part of the U.S. gold medal team last year in the World Juniors. Jonathan Audie Marchessault, another former New York Rangers prospect. So they have a very deep prospect pool. Cody Golubev, who could also play in the NHL this year. So to me, a very, very, way deeper prospect pool than the Carolina Hurricanes from top to bottom. However, the one prospect on this list that has always caught my eye has to be the number 8 prospect, left winger Kirby Reichel. Son of former NHL forward Warren Reichel, former enforcer, 19th selection in the 2013 draft, the only player drafted this past year coming off back-to-back 40-goal seasons, a guy who could play basically any role on any forward line that you ask him to. If you ask him to be an enforcer, he'll do it. If you ask him to be a shutdown forward, he'll do it. If you ask him to be a scorer, he'll do it. This is a guy who can basically do anything. He did it for the Windsor Spitfires the past couple of years. We'll have another year in juniors to do it. So this is going to be a very good player. Needs to work on his skating and his defensive play, but if he can round that out, he'll be a really good player for this team for years to come. Now, the player on this Columbus Blue Jackets team that I think needs to be good in order for this team to be a playoff team this year, no question whatsoever, has to be Marian Gaborik. Marian Gaborik came over, and when he came over, it looked like he was starting to come back a bit. However, overall, it doesn't erase a rough and inconsistent season overall. That includes his time with the New York Rangers. So if this team's going to be a playoff team, Marian Gaborik has to go back to being that superstar scorer we know he has the potential of being, and he needs to stay healthy. A player who is prone to injuries. Hasn't been recently, but still prone to injuries. Now, is this team a playoff team? I like their team. I love their defense. Their defense is probably the best part of their team. And Bobrovsky, again, coming off a Vezina Trophy. When was the last time we saw a goalie win a Vezina Trophy from a non-playoff team? But it's up front where the questions lie. You know, who knows how good their offense is going to be. They were 24th last year. Put that in consideration, plus the teams that are in the East ahead of them. I'm going to say they're going to be a bubble team, but at the end, I think they'll have struggles this year. I don't think they're going to be a playoff team. I think they'll come close, but at the end, of the day, I don't think they're going to make it. But next year, they probably will. I think they're going in the right direction. All right, guys, that'll do it for episode 26 of Hockey on the Spot. Join me again tomorrow. Get ready, hometown boys, because tomorrow, you all may want to watch tomorrow's episode, because tomorrow we're talking about the New Jersey Devils. So until then, This has been Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Join me again tomorrow. Thank you and have a great day.